Okay, question for you. Do you struggle getting those nice sharp ganached edges on your square cakes? If you answered yes, you are not alone. How about covering square cakes in fondant? Another struggle? Well, in this video, I'm going to show you the way I do it to achieve beautiful results every time. Let's go. Hey guys, welcome to That's Cakeable. I'm Janine. Let's get on with this square ganached cake. So the first thing I have to do is to secure my cake board to my setup board, and I do that using just a little bit of ganache. Once that's done, you can start layering up your cake. Now you want to make sure that your cake is slightly smaller than that base board you're using. If it's baked that way, great. If not, just trim the edges. Let's start layering. For this cake, I'm using 5 layers of chocolate mud cake that I'm filling with smooth chocolate ganache. Once the entire cake is filled and stacked, go ahead and give the whole thing a light crumb coat. Then once that's done, pop it aside to chill for about 5 or 10 minutes. Now the cake's chilled, it's time to get on with the good ganache coat. To start my good coat, I add a generous amount of chocolate ganache to the top of the cake and smooth that all out. And don't worry too much if this isn't perfectly level now, we'll get back to that part later. I then place another cake board that is the same size as the base cake board on top. Now with this board, I've covered it in some plastic wrap, which will make taking it off later on even easier. With that cake board on top, you want to take a scraper and make sure that it matches up evenly to the base cake board also. Check every side and all the corners. This is really, really important. Once you're happy that everything's even, it's time to start adding the ganache. Now the whole point here is to fill in the gap between the top cake board and the base cake board with ganache. At this stage, you want to be pretty generous. Go ahead and do all the sides and then add just that bit extra to get those corners done. Now, as you can see here, I don't have my corners perfect just yet. I'm going to give it one more chill and come back and finish it off. Once that part's done, just chuck it back in the fridge for about 10 minutes and let it firm up. Okay, the cake is nice and chilled and firmed up now. Let's get working on getting those perfect sharp edges. On the corner of the cake, you want to add a lot of ganache. Be super, super generous here. Then, taking your bench scraper, scrape along the side of the cake boards. I find that pushing the cake scraper away from me actually really helps the process. Moving from one side of the corner to the other side of the corner with the scraper, you'll eventually get a gorgeous, straight, sharp edge. Now this is going to take some time, so don't rush it, be patient, and you will see results. Once I'm happy with how that's all filled in, I take my scraper and I dip it in some boiling hot water, then I dry it off and go ahead and perfect those edges. Now that's looking pretty sexy. Once that's done, you guessed it, back in the fridge for about 10 minutes. Now that the edges on that cake are nice and firm, it's time to take the top off. And this is where that plastic wrap comes into play and makes life so much easier. I just cut off the plastic wrap and the board just pops right off. Remove any excess plastic wrap, and then it's time to start leveling out the top. Firstly, you want to go in and fill in any little gaps that have been left behind where the cake board was. Then give the entire top of the cake a nice smooth ganache coat. Once again, take your scraper and start smoothing the top of the cake. Don't worry about it going over the edges, we'll fix that up shortly. I also use the hot water method on my scraper to get that nice, flat, even top. I then use my spirit level on both sides of the cake to make sure that I have it nice and even. If I don't, of course, I just go back in and build up areas or remove areas that need leveling out to make it nice and even. Once you're happy that the top of the cake is nice and level, take your scraper and just scrape very carefully around the top edges of the cake. You'll find that that ganache will probably gather up and make a little bit of a lip around the edges. Because the cake should be pretty cold at this stage, seeing we've fridged it about 20 times, just take a blade dipped in hot water and go around very carefully and remove those top edges. If you then want to go ahead with your bench scraper and give it a quick tidy with the hot water method, then go ahead. And that is it. We now have a perfectly sharp edged square ganached cake. Now my recommendation from here on in is to let that cake set at room temperature overnight on your bench top. By the time you get back to it in the morning, it'll be really nice and firm and ready to cover with less struggle. Okay, now that you've allowed your cake to set, preferably overnight, it's time to start covering it in fondant. Go ahead and measure your cake to ensure that you have enough fondant for the top and all the sides. I always prefer to use a little bit more than not have enough. To prepare the cake for the fondant, we need it to have something to be able to stick to. You can either use shortening or corn syrup, piping gel, but I prefer just to use hot water. I brush my hot water on with a large paintbrush and make sure that I've got every single corner, edge, top to bottom completely covered. Now I go ahead and roll out my fondant nice and big till it's about 3 millimeters thick. Using an acupuncture needle, I go ahead and pop any air bubbles that may have formed during the rolling process. I roll up my fondant onto my rolling pin, and then with my cake in front of me, I very carefully drape that fondant over the top of the cake. Now this is where you've got to work fast. Make sure you get straight in there and secure those corners of the cake. Once all those corners are secured, you then want to go ahead and basically start covering the sides the same way that you cover a round cake. So you want to fan out the excess fondant on the sides, and very slowly, working from the top to the bottom, you want to smooth that fondant onto the side of the cake. Pulling it out along the way to avoid pleats. Then go ahead and do that with all 4 sides. Now at this stage, the cake isn't looking the prettiest, but that's okay. We'll make it look gorgeous very, very soon. I just take my fondant smoother, making sure the fondant's pushed right up against the cake. And then with a knife, I cut the excess fondant from around the base of the cake. Now it's time to put the mussel in and get the cake looking nice and smooth and sharp. So you'll see that I don't use just one method, I use quite a few. I use my fondant smoothers as well as my flexi smoothers to get those nice sharp edges. I do that all around the top of the cake, as well as on the corners. I also take my flexi smoother and make sure that all of the sides of the cake end up nice and flat and smooth. Now while you're doing this, you may notice that you manipulate the corners of your cake and they don't look quite sharp enough, but it's okay, we'll come back and finish those off in just a second. Once again, using a combination of your fondant smoothers and your flexi smoothers, go around on those corners and smooth them out. Placing them side by side together and running them up and down the corners ensures that you get a nice sharp edge. I also do the same around the top of the cake. Now it can be time consuming and it is a labor of love, But if you follow these tips, you will end up with a nice sharp-edged cake. I also found that using corner smoothers on square cakes can be really, really helpful. I'll put a link in the description below of where you can find these smoothers. And that is it. With a little bit of patience and persistence, you can end up with a nice, sharp-edged, fondant-covered cake too. Well guys, thanks so much for joining me. I hope you really enjoyed this video. If you did, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell so that you're informed every time I upload a new video. I've also been doing a whole lot of other projects, which includes a whole lot of other tutorials. I'll put the links in the description below of where you can find those also. And now that I've shown you how this is done, it's your turn. Time for you to go and get your cake on. I'll see you next time, guys. Bye-bye.